In part 1 of this film, we defined the term Black Confederate as any Confederate national of full or partial African ancestry, and who participated in the Southern war effort in a more up-close capacity than just working in factories or on plantations. We covered different types of Black Confederate soldiers, from the 2 companies recruited in Richmond in March 1865, to mixed-race Southerners passing for white in the Army. We also covered Black sailors in the Confederate Navy, which was less hostile to Black enlistment than the Army. Though they saw a lot of combat working as civilians on or near the battlefield, Black Southerners would be excluded from being soldiers in the rebel army for most of the war. That is a fact, regardless of how many people have been confused by photos of body servants in gray uniforms. However, there were over 1,000 Southern freemen of color who were able to join state militias, including African Americans of light and dark complexions serving as commissioned officers and NCOs. We'll begin part 2 of this film with Black Confederate militias, which were organizations separate and distinct from the Confederate Army. The most famous example of a Black Confederate militia is the 1st Louisiana Native Guards Regiment, which formed in April 1861. This photo is not the 1st Louisiana Native Guards. It's a photo of volunteers from the 25th U.S. Colored Troops dressed in light blue, which shows up gray on the black and white film, with the federal officer cropped out and the text added to paint a false narrative. In other words, it's literally fake news. These guys were the 1st Louisiana Native Guards. Well, their officers at least. The volunteers were mostly mixed-race Creoles who were businessmen and property owners, with many of them owning at least a handful of slaves. Over 1,500 men were enrolled in the founding meetings, but ultimately 1,135 free men of color were duly enlisted in 14 companies in the regiment. Their zeal in offering their services to the governor in April 1861 could plausibly be explained both by a desire to curry favor with the white planter government and to protect their own privilege as free men of color during a time when Southern states were passing increasingly strict laws clamping down on their freedom and privileges. For example, one way that they were trailblazing to reclaim lost ground is that forming this militia regiment in Louisiana was a long shot in the first place. In 1853, state law restricted service in the militia to whites only, yet the governor accepted them into service, in violation of the 1853 state law, but also within his powers as commander-in-chief of the state forces during wartime. They looked sharp in their gray uniforms, and these guys had the resources to procure their own uniforms. Although they marched in a number of parades in 1861, behind the state flag and the stars and bars, they were consistently passed over for guard duty at key state installations, or of escorting enemy prisoners of war, with the state's military department favoring white militia for these assignments. Then in January of 1862, when the Union Army was at the gates, the Native Guards were disbanded, when the entire state militia was reorganized with new unit designations and conveniently without the free men of color. Hence, when the Federal Army entered the city of New Orleans, the 1st Louisiana Native Guards surrendered, and many of them switched sides and joined the new 1st Louisiana Native Guards, wearing blue and serving the Union military government of Louisiana. If you look up the bios of the 14 company commanders from April 1861, most of their names pop up again in the new Union version of the Louisiana Native Guards. On one hand, this was a milestone for African American achievement in that these Creoles were both the 1st Regiment of Black Confederate Militia and the 1st Regiment of Black Union Militia, and these troops would be the mold on which the U.S. Colored Troops were made. On the flip side, keep in mind that these Southern Creole property owners were under siege from both sides. The Confederate ruling class was hostile to free men of color and paranoid about race wars, while the incoming Union Army was paranoid about the loyalty of rebel militiamen and perfectly willing to confiscate their property. But in 1862, if the New Orleanians served the Union, then their property, including slaves, were not contraband, and the Federal Army wouldn't take it all away. So again, slavery and socioeconomic status was still a huge deal for these particular Southerners despite their mixed ancestry. Now I should mention, after a while, the Union commander of New Orleans, got tired of having black soldiers, so he actually purged all the line officers from the 2nd Regiment of Louisiana Native Guards. I don't know why, but he stopped his purge before he got to the 1st and the 3rd Regiments. It is what it is. It's not something to be proud of, but since a lot of these guys were veterans of the old Confederate Native Guards, it deserves to be mentioned here. There were other militia units formed by mixed-race freemen of color in the rural parts of the state. The Augustine Guards were French-speaking Creoles, and they occasionally published notices in the Natchitoches Union in French. They even published a scathing letter calling on the authorities not to force the French speakers to read documents in English. Another militia company of predominantly light-skinned freemen of color were the Monet Guards. There were several other Creole militias in Louisiana in 1861, but they weren't accepted into state active duty. All they did that year was drill, and when the state militia was reorganized in January 1862, these guys weren't in it. One of the more interesting cases of black militia in the Confederacy was the company of Creole militia from Mobile, Alabama. After the Southern Draft began taking a toll on the militia and home guard, the Alabama legislature passed a law allowing Creoles in and around the city of Mobile to enlist in the state militia for home defense. This population was exceptional, since the 1860 census shows that less than 1% of Alabama's African American population were free persons. 60 freemen of color enlisted in a company they called the Creole Guards, but they had no intention of sticking with home defense. The Adjutant General's press release referred to the Creole Guards as Company A of the Creole Volunteers. This meant that the state meant to experiment with at least a battalion of mixed-race troops for service in the Army. As impressive an accomplishment that this is for these men of color to have carved out such a niche for themselves in Alabama society, these guys were less than 1% of 1% of the state's black population. These particular Creole volunteers embraced the Confederacy and what it stood for, and some of them were also slave owners. Much of their existence was them proving to the white planter and merchant classes that they were more like them than like African Americans who were darker and not free. In November 1863, Confederate Major General Dabney Maury and the Adjutant General of the Army wrote to the Secretary of War requesting permission to enroll the Creole Guards as Army soldiers. General Maury explained the Creoles to the Secretary with these words: "When Spain ceded this territory to the United States in 1803, the Creoles were guaranteed all the immunities and privileges of the citizens of the United States, and have continued to enjoy them up to this time. They have, many of them, Negro blood in the degree which disqualifies other persons of Negro race from the rights of citizens, but they do not stand here on the footing of Negroes." The Confederate Secretary of War's response was clear as day. "Our position with the North and before the world will not allow the employment as armed soldiers of Negroes. If these Creoles can be naturally and properly discriminated from Negroes, the authority may be considered as conferred, otherwise not, unless you can enlist them as navvies, to use the English term, or for subordinate working purposes." Navvies were laborers who built fortifications and other engineering projects. It is documented that some of the navvies drafted to build earthworks for the Confederate forces at the First Battle of Manassas were also forced to serve as artillery crews during a desperate moment of the battle. But returning to the quote, to paraphrase, the Secretary of War said that if the Creole Guards could pass for white, then they had the green light to come into the Army. But if they were even just dark enough to be distinguished as not all white, then they could do hard labor. If the Creole Guards had been used as navvies, then their legal status according to Confederate Army regulations would have been contractors, not soldiers. The Creoles were not up for that, since that would have been a huge downgrade from their social status as businessmen and slave owners. Hence, the Creole Guards were black Confederate militiamen, but they were not soldiers in the Confederate Army. None of this is meant to diminish their courage or the importance of their service to the war effort. The point is that while many black Southerners, free or slaves, had white neighbors or acquaintances who thought highly of them, even some with white relatives whom they were deeply fond of, it keeps coming back to this. No matter how hard black Southerners tried to prove their quality, there were institutional roadblocks repeatedly placed in their way by the national government and by the whole Southern social ladder. Like I said at the beginning of this film, The hard evidence for black Confederates makes Southern black men look incredible, while it makes the cause they served look all the worse. Now here's where things get interesting. Let's talk about where and when the Confederate Army explicitly allowed black enlistees to serve and work. Whether you agree with my interpretation of the primary source evidence or not, thank you for watching the Civil War, Wild West Edition. If you haven't seen the Confederate territory of Arizona yet, give it a go. I think you'll like it.